15th of August, 1944. A narrow lane outside Falaise, Normandy. The morning mist hasn't yet lifted when Sergeant Michael Thornton of the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment spots something that makes his blood run cold. Through the hedgerow, perhaps 300 meters distant, the unmistakable silhouette of a Tiger tank emerges from the gray. 80 tons of Krupp steel, armed with an 88mm gun that can punch through his Sherman's armor from nearly 2 kilometers away. His own gun can barely scratch it from this range. The Tiger's turret begins its slow, deliberate traverse. Thornton has perhaps 15 seconds before that gun finds him. But instead of reversing into cover, he does something that seems suicidal. He orders his driver forward, straight toward the beast. The Sherman accelerates, engine screaming, closing the gap. 200 meters, 150. The Tiger's gun flashes, the shell screaming overhead by mere inches. 100 meters. Thornton's gunner fires. The small projectile streaks across the closing distance, trailing a thin plume of smoke. It strikes the Tiger's frontal armor and detonates. When the smoke clears, the Tiger sits motionless, flames beginning to lick from its hatches. Thornton has just employed what would become known as the most effective tank-killing innovation of the entire war, a weapon so devastatingly simple that the Germans never quite solved it, and so secret that even decades later, exact production figures remain partially classified. This is the story of how British engineers turned physics itself into a weapon. By the summer of 1942, Britain faced a problem that threatened to undo everything gained through years of desperate fighting. German armored doctrine had evolved beyond the Panzer III and IV medium tanks that British forces had learned to combat in North Africa. Intelligence reports filtering back from the Eastern Front spoke of something new. Tanks with armor thickness approaching 100 millimeters, mounting guns of unprecedented power. When the first Tiger I appeared in Tunisia in December 1942, British tank crews discovered their worst fears confirmed. The standard British anti-tank weapon, the 2-pounder gun, bounced shells off Tiger armor like pebbles off concrete. Even the newer 6-pounder, rushed into service in 1942, proved inadequate. During the Battle of Kasserine Pass, American and British forces watched in horror as Tigers shrugged off direct hits that should have been catastrophic. The mathematics were brutally simple. A Tiger's frontal armor measured 100 millimeters of face-hardened steel angled at optimal deflection angles. British armor-piercing shot, traveling at roughly 800 meters per second, carried enough kinetic energy to penetrate perhaps 70 millimeters under ideal conditions. The gap between what existed and what was needed measured 30 millimeters of steel, but it might as well have been 30 meters of solid rock. Tank crews took to carrying extra ammunition, not because they expected to penetrate, but because they hoped that sheer volume of fire might damage vision ports or tracks. It didn't work. By early 1943, British armored units were suffering catastrophic losses. In one engagement near Medjez El Bab, a single Tiger destroyed 11 British tanks in 15 minutes without receiving meaningful damage. The psychological impact proved almost as destructive as the physical losses. Tank crews began abandoning positions at the mere rumor of Tigers in the area. Something had to change, and quickly. The solution emerged not from traditional weapons design, but from a fundamental rethinking of how projectiles penetrate armor. In late 1942, a team at the Ministry of Supply's research facility in Fort Halstead, Kent, led by metallurgist Sir Charles Ellis and physicist Neville Mott, began investigating shaped charge technology. The concept itself wasn't new. The Monroe effect, discovered in 1888, demonstrated that explosive charges with a hollow cavity could focus detonation energy into a penetrating jet. What Ellis and Mott realized was that previous attempts had failed to properly understand the physics involved. When a shaped charge detonates, the explosive force collapses a metal liner, typically copper, into a superplastic jet traveling at velocities exceeding 8,000 meters per second. This jet doesn't penetrate through kinetic energy alone. Instead, it behaves like a fluid flowing through armor plate in a process metallurgists call hydrodynamic penetration. The metal doesn't need to be harder than the armor. It simply needs to be moving fast enough that both the jet and the target behave as fluids under extreme pressure. The team at Fort Halstead constructed hundreds of test charges, experimenting with liner geometry, standoff distance, and explosive composition. They discovered that a cone angle of 42 degrees produced optimal jet formation. The standoff distance, the gap between the charge and the target, proved critical. Too close, and the jet hadn't fully formed. Too far, and it dispersed before impact. The optimal distance measured approximately 2.5 times the charge diameter. By March 1943, they had a working prototype designated Heat High Explosive Anti-Tank. The charge itself measured 75 millimeters in diameter, small enough to be fired from existing guns. Inside a mild steel casing sat 400 grams of Composition B explosive, surrounding a precision-machined copper cone just 1.2 millimeters thick. At the charge's base, a simple impact fuse triggered detonation. When tested against 100 millimeter armor plate at the Shoebury Nest Proving Grounds, the results exceeded all predictions. The shaped charge burned through the steel like a cutting torch through butter, creating a hole roughly 12 millimeters wide but penetrating to depths exceeding 120 millimeters. The designers immediately recognized they had something revolutionary. Production contracts went to multiple facilities: ROF Chorley in Lancashire, ROF Glascoat in Wales, and several smaller manufacturers across the Midlands. By June 1943, production reached approximately 50,000 rounds per month, though exact figures for the entire war remain classified. The rounds were issued under strict security protocols. Tank crews received them in sealed containers marked only with cryptic designations. Even the ammunition itself bore no external markings indicating its special nature. The first operational use came during Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. Lieutenant James Crawford's Churchill tank encountered a Tiger near Gerbini Airfield. At a range of just 60 meters, Crawford's gunner fired one of the new rounds. The detonation produced an unusual flash, brighter and more orange than conventional shells. The Tiger's turret hatches blew open instantly, and smoke began pouring out. The crew abandoned the vehicle within seconds. Post-battle examination revealed the shaped charge had penetrated the Tiger's side armor and ignited ammunition stored in the turret basket. By the Normandy campaign, British tank crews had developed specific tactics around heat ammunition. The rounds were most effective against stationary or slow-moving targets, as the precise standoff distance required meant that any significant angle of impact reduced penetration. Crews learned to close to within 200 meters when possible, maximizing accuracy and ensuring the fuse functioned properly. During the fighting around Caen, one Churchill squadron claimed 7 Tiger kills in 3 days using almost exclusively heat rounds. The psychological impact on German crews became apparent in captured documents. One Tiger commander, interrogated after his capture near Tilly-sur-Seulles, reported that his crew had begun to fear the quiet British shells that produced unusual detonations. The shaped charge's detonation signature differed noticeably from conventional rounds, creating a sharper crack and a distinctive flash that German crews learned to recognize and dread. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The Germans, of course, had their own shaped charge technology. The Panzerfaust, introduced in 1943, used a similar principle. However, the Panzerfaust was a disposable close-range weapon, not a gun-fired projectile. German attempts to develop heat ammunition for tank guns foundered on manufacturing precision issues. Their shaped charges showed inconsistent performance, with penetration varying wildly from round to round. Intelligence assessments suggested this resulted from difficulties in producing the copper liners to sufficient tolerances under wartime conditions. The Americans developed their own version, designated M67, but not until late 1944. British heat rounds were already in widespread use by then, and combat reports from American tank crews indicate they frequently traded for British ammunition when possible. Soviet forces received samples through Lend-Lease but apparently struggled to manufacture the precise copper liners required. Their post-war shaped charge development clearly drew on British designs. What made the British version superior was manufacturing precision. The copper liners required tolerances within 50 microns, far tighter than standard munitions work. This precision, achieved through specialized die stamping equipment installed in the ROF facilities, ensured consistent jet formation. German intelligence obtained samples, but couldn't replicate the manufacturing process at scale. Comparative testing after the war showed British heat rounds achieved penetration values 15 to 20% higher than German equivalents of similar size. The difference lay entirely in manufacturing quality control. The actual impact of heat ammunition on the war's outcome remains debatable among historians. Some argue that German heavy tanks were already suffering from mechanical unreliability and fuel shortages and would have been defeated regardless. Others point to specific engagements where heat rounds demonstrably prevented what could have been catastrophic British defeats. What's beyond dispute is the psychological impact. German tank commanders, previously confident in their armor superiority, suddenly faced a weapon that negated their advantage. This led to more cautious deployment of Tigers and Panthers, reducing their battlefield effectiveness even when heat rounds weren't present. The technology's influence on post-war development proved enormous. Every modern anti-tank missile, from the British Swingfire to the American Tau, uses shaped charge warheads descended directly from the Fort Halstead designs. The basic physics remains unchanged. The hollow charge effect discovered in 1888 and weaponized in 1943 still represents the most effective method of defeating armored vehicles. Surviving examples of the original ammunition can be seen at the Royal Armouries Museum in Leeds, though regulations prohibit display of live rounds. The copper liners, green with age, look almost delicate, hardly the stuff of revolutionary weapons. Yet these thin copper cones, machined to tolerances finer than a human hair, represented a fundamental shift in armored warfare. 15th of August, 1944. Sergeant Michael Thornton climbs from his Sherman, legs shaking, ears ringing from the close engagement. The Tiger sits 50 meters away, still burning. He walks closer, against standing orders, driven by a need to see what stopped the beast. The entry hole in the armor plate measures no more than the width of his thumb. Around it, the steel shows no cracking, no spalling, no external damage at all, just a neat round hole, edges still glowing red. Inside, the devastation tells a different story. The shaped charges jet has carved through ammunition racks, fuel tanks, hydraulics. Everything the jet touched is burned. The Tiger's crew never had a chance. Thornton had been issued just 3 heat rounds. He has 2 left. Before Normandy, he'd commanded a tank for 11 months and never once penetrated a heavy German tank's frontal armor. Now he's done it at 100 meters, with a shell that weighs less than a bag of sugar. The physics that made it possible, the collapsed copper cone traveling faster than any bullet, the hydrodynamic penetration that turned solid steel into liquid, all of that remains mysterious to him. What he understands, what every British tank crew in Normandy understands by August 1944, is that the Tigers can be killed. The seemingly invulnerable can burn. Fort Halstead's metallurgists and physicists, working in a converted country house in Kent, had turned one of nature's fundamental forces into a weapon. They had made armor thickness irrelevant. The Tiger's 100 millimeters of Krupp steel, forged in the finest German foundries, hardened and angled for maximum protection, had proven no more resistant to properly applied physics than paper to flame. That was the British trick. Not superior armor, not bigger guns, just copper, explosives, and an understanding of how metal behaves under impossible pressures. In the end, that proved more than enough.